Hello and welcome back to Levant TV's Press Review. Let's begin with a look at today's UK front pages. The Guardian leads its front page with former Home Secretary Dave Blunkett calling for a review of British intelligence law to keep up with new technologies. It also continues its coverage on former News of the World's editor Rebecca Brooks' trial on the phone hacking scandal and features its story on what Jeremy Paxman really thinks of politics. Like many other papers, we'll see it features a picture of David Cameron's wife Samantha Cameron joining in on Diwali celebrations in London. The Daily Telegraph also features a picture of Samantha Cameron titled Samantha's Diwali Sari as Mrs. Cameron walks barefoot through the temple in London. It leads its main page with a story on the Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt saying to curb NHS executives' salaries so more can be spent on patients. It also takes a look at David Cameron's pledging to campaign for Britain to remain part of the European Union. The Times, similar to The Guardian and The Telegraph, also features a picture of Samantha Cameron celebrating Diwali festivities. It leads its front page with reports on the terror suspect who disappeared after being under surveillance from dressing up in a burqa, and also reports on the boss of British Gas saying that he will forgo his bonuses of up to £3.5 million this year in a move to put pressure on other utility bosses to do the same. The Independent's front page features a picture of former News of the World editor Rebecca Brooks as it continues its coverage on the story of the phone hacking trial as new evidence emerges in court revealing a Brooks plot to destroy evidence. Its lead story reports on concerns being raised after leaked US documents revealed that Britain operates a top-secret listening post from its Berlin embassy. Now let's take a look at the top stories in the Middle East. In an article headlined with presence of all players necessary in Geneva II, Armenian daily newspaper Panorama analyzes the Geneva II conference through an interview with Hossein Rouveyran, analyst of Middle Eastern affairs. Rouveyran says, with regards to the process of the Geneva II conference, the strategy of overthrowing the government, which has been pursued until now, has not been successful and has been replaced with a strategy of political dialogue. He explains that the West has reached conclusion that the solution to the Syrian crisis is political and within the framework of Geneva II, so the Arab countries must accept the new situation. However, he says that Ibrahimi's efforts in the region to reach a conclusion have been opposed by certain Arab states, for example Saudi Arabia, which did not allow Ibrahimi to visit it, or in other words, it has not yet accepted the concept of a political solution for this crisis. He goes on to explain why Saudi is pressuring opposition groups to prevent them from participating in the Geneva II conference. If this project becomes political, then it would mean political defeat for Saudi Arabia, which has spent billions of dollars in this regard. Such issues create concerns for Saudi Arabia, accepting defeat and the possibility of revenge. With regards to Turkey and Qatar's participation in Geneva II conference, Rouveyran claims the government of Syria has approved the process that Qatar will no longer interfere in Syrian affairs, and within this framework it can be said that Qatar is a relatively neutral country with regards to its position in Syria, which has left its former role. As for Turkey, it is facing a contradiction. On the one hand, it played a significant role in organizing and dispatching forces and arms to Syria to overthrow the government, and on the other hand, it's concerned now about Al-Qaeda forces pouring into Turkey, as they have done in Iraq and Lebanon. Rouveyran points out that Ibrahimi's visits and planning for the Geneva II conference indicate that there is a new outlook about this crisis. In the Geneva I conference, the US and Russia reached an agreement, but right now this outlook is completely different. He adds the fact is that this crisis is complicated and multidimensional. One dimension of it is domestic and the differences between the government and the opposition, and that the president of Al-Qaeda complicates the situation. And he continues, the other dimension is at the regional level, where Iran supports the governments of Syria and Saudi Arabia, and Turkey supports the opposition. And when asked about Iran's stance towards Bashar al-Assad no longer remaining in power, Rouviaran says that Iran believes that based on the UN Charter, the right to determine the country's destiny belongs to the people. Therefore, it is the people of Syria which must determine who or what group should rule their country in the future. And he adds, any elimination or balancing or precondition shows the concern of one side and would later show that these countries do not accept elections and the people's rule. Therefore, the proposal of the issue that Bashar al-Assad must not be a candidate is from a position of weakness. But the non-presence of all players in Geneva would damage the process and could create problems for this conference and cause it to fail or lead to the decisions made there not being implemented. Looking at the Turkish-Syrian relations, Hurriyet Daily News headlines an article with Ankara must convince Syrian opposition. Here, Semih Hadiz looks at President Abdullah Gül's recent interview with The Guardian. The writer explains that meeting has become the basis of the Erdogan government's often repeated argument that it did its best to convince al-Assad to do the right thing when everyone else was shying away from getting involved. Gül was merely repeating this argument. He adds that Turkey at this stage was flying high in terms of self-assurance. The assumption in Ankara was that al-Assad, like Zain al-Abidin bin Ali, Hosni Mubarak and Muammar Gaddafi, would fall quickly and Turkey would step in as a predominantly Islamic soft power to act as a midwife for Syrian democracy. He also points out that Syria is predominantly Sunni country and the ballot box in that country would bring the Muslim Brotherhood, considered an Islamic ally by the AKP, to prominence as it did eventually in Egypt. But Hadiz claims that there were reasons why the international community was cautious on Syria. Ankara's instincts at the time, however, failed to consider the demographic and sociological factors that rapidly turned the crisis in Syria into a sectarian civil war. He goes on to say that Ankara underestimated the importance of the Moscow-Damascus and the Tehran-Damascus links, which not only provided al-Assad with political support, but also a well-supplied military. The writer claims that the problem is that Ankara, after the famous 6 hours in Damascus, insisted on failing to see what was brewing in that country. And he adds instead, it became a party to the conflict by basing its policy on the singular need to oust al-Assad by force. It even supported al-Qaeda-affiliated groups fighting al-Assad to expedite this outcome. By taking sides in this way, Ankara also reveals its heavy Sunni leanings. This in turn alienated Christian and Shiite communities in the countries and the Middle East. The writer indicates that all of this resulted in Turkey's losing its capacity to influence the efforts now being spearheaded by Moscow and Washington to solve the Syrian crisis through negotiations. Gül now expects a very solid position with respect to Syria from the international community. Hadiz says that the nature of this crisis and where the world stands in terms of trying to end this crisis has not been understood in Ankara yet. At the moment, the only game in town for the international community is Geneva II. To conclude, Hadiz claimed the best way for Ankara to be an active part of effort to solve the Syria crisis now is not to keep blaming the international community for being inactive, but to convince the Syrian opposition, which refuses to go to Geneva, that the only option left to solve this crisis and end the slaughter of innocents as soon as possible is a negotiated settlement. From Beirut, Aaron Baker writes to the Time magazine an article headlined "Syria blames rebel for polio outbreak and the blame game begins." Baker starts the article stating, less than a week after the World Health Organization confirmed that 10 Syrian children had been paralyzed by polio, the Syrian regime capitalized on their suffering for propaganda purposes. Baker quotes Minister of Social Affairs Kinda Shammat saying the virus originates in Pakistan and has been brought to Syria by the jihadists who come from Pakistan. Baker claims that while the Pakistan origin theory was floated by international health officials last week, the World Health Organization has yet to complete the genetic sequencing of the Syrian virus that would prove it came from Pakistan. Baker explains even if the virus did originate in Pakistan, there would still be no way to tell how it came to Syria. According to the World Health Organization's polio eradication spokesman Oliver Rosenbauer, an adult fighter is the best likely of carriers. The virus tends to travel with children who have not yet been vaccinated. Al-Shammad goes on to say that polio was eradicated in 1999 in Syria, the first Arab state to implement mass immunization. But late last month, health officials reported that 22 children from the contested province of Deir ez-Zor suffered from sudden onset paralysis, a symptom of polio. The other 12 cases are awaiting confirmation. Baker points out, in pointing fingers at foreign ministers, the government is attempting to shift blame to the rebel part of a regime narrative that the armed opposition is funded by outsiders and controlled by foreign terrorists. The writer quotes Dr. Fouad Fouad, a Syrian epidemiologist currently teaching at the American University of Beirut, saying that where the virus originated is less of importance than how it was able to take root, and for that he holds the Syrian Ministry of Health responsible. It is possible that polio was brought in by Pakistani fighters, but the blame should start earlier, he says. And to conclude, Baker says it's not easy if the 3 million children that need to be vaccinated will be reached. She claims Syria's children will require an international resolution on par with the chemical weapons accord that forced Assad to give up his arsenal. If not, Syria could join Pakistan, Afghanistan and Nigeria as a potential exporter of a disease that should be on its way to extinction. As thousands of Iranians took to the street yesterday to mark the 34th anniversary of the takeover of the US Embassy and voiced their opposition to President Hassan Rouhani's efforts to establish rapprochement with Washington, let's take a look at what the papers are saying about the relationship between Iran and the US. The Wall Street Journal features an opinion piece on the renewed negotiation between Iran and the US headlined, "Iran to America, let's do business." Writer Sohrab Ahmari says Barack Obama's renewed negotiations with the Islamic Republic over Tehran's nuclear weapons program haven't yielded concrete progress yet. Some congressional Democrats are already proposing a pause in sanctions as a show of goodwill. Sohrab says the mullahs have taken notice and they're working to translate US policy concessions into gains for Iran's ailing economy, asking but how to alleviate the concerns of US business about establishing commercial ties in one of the world's least free societies. Sohrab believes that risky certainly describes the wobbling Iranian economy, which is dominated by Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Other barriers to doing business in Iran include the country's opaque labyrinthine governance and culture of corruption. The Islamic Republic ranked 133rd in Transparency International's 2012 Corruption Perceptions Index. He interviews Iranian-American businessman A.G. Miller, born Ikram Manafzadeh, who believes the increasing economic ties between the country would also benefit US exporters, noting that airliners sitting in US desert storage facilities are ripe for sale. Iran would be a major buyer and aircraft as soon as sanctions are lifted. Sohrab concludes that a regime long comfortable with operating in the grey zones of the global economy is already positioning itself to profit from Washington's softening approach. Let's hope the bargain is worth it. Writing for China's Asia Times, Kavi Afrasiabi takes a look at America's forked tongue on Iran. Taking a look at the rally in Tehran to mark the 34th anniversary of the takeover of the US Embassy, Kavi believes the rally has taken place at a crucial time for the marathon nuclear negotiations due to resume in Geneva next week. According to Kavi, the Obama administration is directly responsible for fueling anti-American sentiment, not simply because of its record of hostilities that include covert cyber warfare and presidential authorizations that have added weight to crippling sanctions on Iran, but also due to the contradictory and incoherent approach of US officials. Kavi mentions Wendy Sherman, top US negotiator, saying Sherman billed the last Geneva round as serious and substantive, and yet in the same breath insulted the Iranian national character with her undiplomatic statement that deception is part of Iranians' DNA. Kavi adds not only that chairman, who is under considerable fire by the pro-Israeli lobby in Washington for supposedly titling in favor of a deal with Iran, has now gone on Israeli television denying categorically that the US has any intention of offering sanctions relief to Iran. And to conclude, Kavi says the ambiguities of the US-Iran policy will be put on full display come the next round of talks in Geneva, adding that ending the US doublespeak is mandatory, otherwise Iranian suspicions will remain that Washington's true intention is a win-lose. Israel's Jerusalem Post also takes a look at the contradictions being sent out from Washington, headlining their article, "Mixed Messages from Washington on Iran Policy." Writer Herb Cannon asks, what does America really think? US Secretary of State John Kerry may face Israeli fire when he meets Netanyahu in Jerusalem Wednesday over comments made on US approach to Iran's nuclear issue. Herb analyzes Kerry's speech, saying two things Kerry said in that speech were particularly jarring to Jerusalem: that the US wants to put the test whether or not Iran really desires to pursue a peaceful nuclear program. He knows very well their true desires, and his comment that the US would not succumb to those fear tactics that suggest the US not diplomatically engage with Iran to test whether it will make nuclear concessions. Herb believes that from the perspective of the Netanyahu government, there is much wrong with those comments. First of all, why even suggest, as Kerry seemed to do, that Iran may really just desire a peaceful nuclear program? He compares contradictions between Kerry and Hagel, saying, Kerry says the US will not succumb to scare tactics on Iran. Hagel says those scare tactics have actually shown results. So what does America really think? You choose. And to conclude, he believes if there is any consolation in these mixed messages, it is only this: contradictory and confused messaging is not an exclusively Israeli domain. Now let's take a look at the top headlines from international papers. Starting with Iran's Tehran Times, which leads its front page with Iran marking the anniversary of US embassy seizure. The UAE's Gulf News lead story looks at Mohammed Morsi's trial, reporting him telling court that he is the legitimate president of Egypt. The Moscow Times front page leads with the headline, "Nationalism Dominates Day of Unity," as it reports on thousands of Russians gathering in the streets to celebrate National Unity Day with 3 separate rallies. And finally, Washington Post front page leads with a look at the Senate moving closer to passing a historic legislation that will ban discrimination against gay workers, signaling a dramatic shift in political attitudes in the House. That's all for today's quite interesting stories and analysis. Expect us tomorrow for another press review.